Few had been standing on the sands of Seabright Beach in California just a little over a week or so ago. You'd have noticed a young boy playing out in the gently rippling waves and taking in all of the wonderful weather and things that you get to enjoy on a nice beach. But if you had been standing out on those sands and looked out just a few moments later, you wouldn't have seen that boy anymore. What you would have seen actually was him about 20 feet further out to sea, flailing for his life because he had been sucked in by a sudden unexpected billow and the undercurrent had sucked him away. And from where you were standing, you would have thought to yourself, the chances of that boy getting rescued at this point are impossible at worst, unlikely at best. Because he was getting further and further sucked out to sea. The billows were gigantic, and it just did not look likely that boy was going to survive. And you can see all of this on video if you're curious and you want to go watch this later. Just Google boy Seabright Beach. But if you had thought that his rescue was going to be impossible at worst and unlikely at best, you'd have been in for a pleasant surprise that day. Because within a few moments of him getting sucked out, a young 16-year-old boy named Ryder Williams was serving as a lifeguard that day, ran out at great risk to his own life, plunged into those billowing waves and began swimming out to that young boy. He eventually made his way to him, clasped him to his chest, and against all of the waves that threatened to suck him and that boy out, continued slowly but surely and steadily to fight back. And as you watch the video, you can see moment by moment, he's getting closer. A wave comes, sucks him back out a little further, but he leans in, pulls the boy back, gets closer and closer to shore, until finally, after what feels like an eternity, hoping and praying, even though this happened in the past, this boy will be saved. He finally gets close enough to shore that another lifeguard and a group of men come to his aid, begin pulling him out and grabbing the boy and rescuing him. And that young boy is alive and well today because an unlikely hero, a 16-year-old lifeguard named Ryder Williams, was willing to go out, not run away from the waves, not run away from the danger, but run into it, at great risk to his own life, to save a young boy who couldn't do anything for him. A 10-year-old boy isn't going to make any return to him, but he went out and risked his life because he knew that was the right thing to do to save a human life. And so that boy is alive today. Because someone that we might look at, if you're looking at a situation like this where a young boy's life is in danger, I don't know about you, but I don't know that I put 16-year-old boys at the top of the list for who's going to go in and save this kid. Not because I don't know good 16-year-old boys, but because what has culture told us about 16-year-old boys? That they're toxic, that they're all selfish, that they're all lazy, and that they're entitled. And so culturally speaking, you look at that situation and think, that guy's an unlikely hero. And yet, it was him. Not other lifeguards who were older and more mature. Not other people who were on the beach. It was that 16-year-old who went out into the waves and saved that 10-year-old boy. And I'm willing to bet there were other people on the beach that day who had what it took and had the skills necessary to go out into the waves and rescue that boy. But you know what? They didn't go. Whether they were afraid of the billowing waves or whether they had just given up hope and thought, there's no way that any of us can get out and actually rescue this boy. He's going to get sucked out to sea. Whatever the case is, they didn't go. But Ryder Williams did. And because Ryder Williams went out and did the heroic thing, the right thing, the courageous thing, there is a 10-year-old boy who is alive today, probably had breakfast a little while ago with his mom and dad, because of what that young man was willing to do when he was willing to go out and face the danger, face the waves, when everyone else was unwilling. Now, I think there are a lot of spiritual truths embedded inside of that story. Because here is the spiritual reality that you and I are dealing with day in and day out. We are dealing with a dark, broken world that if we're paying any attention, threatens to swamp us and overwhelm us just like it swamped and overwhelmed that 10-year-old boy. I mean, how many of us have turned on the news in the last week and seen another report of the seemingly endless violence in our major cities? How many of us have watched the simultaneous rise of both crazy immorality on the far left with the rise of progressive tactics of helping to chemically castrate confused children who need help, and advocating for systems like Marxism and Nietzscheism and despair? How many of us have seen that and despaired, but also begun to see the overreaction on the far right, where we've got groups of people now that you can read about who are trying to rehabilitate the Nazis and say that they were actually all misunderstood heroes? How many of us have looked around our communities and seen people addled and sucked into the throes of addiction and wondered whether it was possible for us to do anything for them? How many of us have read another report about another pastor in another big church who has fallen into immorality when he was supposed to be modeling the light of the world? How many of us in this room, watching online at our campuses, how many of you have been affected by those floodwaters that washed through our communities? I was talking to a friend recently, and he said those were once in a 1,000-year rains. How many of us have felt absolutely overwhelmed by all this darkness around us and thought to ourselves, there is nothing I can do about that? And just little old me. Jesus wants me to be a flickering candle in that kind of a dark world? Yeah, right. The chances of dispelling that kind of darkness are impossible at worst and unlikely at best. Isn't that what we think? Maybe we don't say those words out loud, but haven't you felt the undertow of despair in your own life when you consider all the darkness, all the decay, and all the brokenness around us? And yet here's the truth. The truth is, we are the light of the world. Jesus Christ, by his Spirit, has equipped us with what we need to make a difference in this dark, decaying, and broken world, just like Ryder Williams running out into the waves and saving that young boy's life. He has given us all that we need for a life of faith and godliness, to keep the commands of the Lord, to trust, follow, obey him, and make a difference in this dark world in our time, even if all we do feel like is just a small flickering candle. Because when we look at ourselves in the mirror and we perhaps subconsciously think to ourselves, have you seen me? Do you know what my qualifications are? You really think, Lord, I can be a light dispelling this kind of darkness? Impossible at worst, unlikely at best. If you've ever thought that, or anything close to it, anything resembling it, you know what's amazing about our God? That's precisely the kind of thing he loves to do. God loves to dispel darkness that looks impossible to us to dispel through the most unlikely people and ways imaginable. Because you know what? When he does that, it makes him look amazing, awesome, glorious, and beautiful. Because when God does the impossible through the most unlikely people, the only appropriate reaction is to say, what a God these people must serve. And so that is why, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be in the Old Testament book of Ruth together. Because what we are going to discover in the story of Ruth is that she lived in one of the darkest periods in the history of God's people. She lived in the days of the Judges. And if you've read the book of Judges, you know what a dark, evil, twisted, messed up time that was for the nation of Israel. It was a time that was marked by a key phrase: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The way we would put that in the modern day would say everyone was living their own truth. It was an evil time. It was a dark time, marked by foreign conquest, marked by spiritual blindness, marked by false worship, violence in the streets, and it was into that darkness that God rekindled the light of hope through three of the most unlikely people imaginable. And as we read about them in this story, we are going to see that God still does the same sort of thing through people just like you and just like me. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn or scroll with me to the book of Ruth. That is where we will be for the next 5 weeks. And that is going to bring us to this first encouragement that we're going to find in Ruth chapter 1, which is this. When we run away from the darkness around us, we are only giving way to the darkness within us. Now, if you go back again, the era of the Judges, it was the darkest time in Israel's history, the darkest period up to that point in history since the days of the flood. And in this time, we're not certain exactly when in the days of the Judges this was happening, but when the story of Ruth begins, it begins with a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and a famine. Not only is Elimelech and his family dealing with the darkness of the Judges and that era of history, they are dealing with the loss of food. And so, at a dark time in Israel's history, Elimelech, whose name literally means, "My God is king," at a time when he and his family could have lived into that name, could have been lights in a dark place, Elimelech decided not to stay and dispel the darkness. Elimelech decided to pull out his luggage, tell his family to pack up, and they decided to head east to the country of Moab. Here's what Ruth chapter 1, starting verses 1 through 2 says. In the days when the Judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Now see, we read there they went to go sojourn. That means they went to go up, take temporary residence. The idea is you'd go there and come back. Well, these verses end by saying they remained there. And not only did they remain there, they went to a country that they should not have gone to. You know, they went east to the land of Moab. And anytime you're reading your Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, what you discover is that when people go to the east, they are going away from the presence of the Lord. They are embracing, in a sense, the darkness within them. Because when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, what did God do? He cast them out to the east of Eden. They went east, away from his presence. When Abram and Lot were standing in the promised land, and Abram said, "Lot, you get first choice. Which land do you want?" He said, "I will take Sodom and Gomorrah, which lies to the east." That's why when the tabernacle and the temple were built, the people of God were supposed to enter from the east. Because entering from the east symbolized they were returning back into the presence of God and away from their sins. And so here is Elimelech and his family, whose name means "My God is king." And where does he go? He goes east. Not just away from the hardship and the darkness that he's not willing to face, but away from the presence of the Lord. Away from the God whom his name claims to be his king. And unfortunately, tragedy and disaster follow this faithless choice. Here's what Ruth verses 3 through 5 say. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, something else that they should not have done as faithful Israelites. But there they were, and they did. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. You see, in just 5 short verses that you can read in about 20 seconds, you have 10 whole years, 1 entire decade of tragedy. Because apparently it wasn't very long after they got into Moab that Elimelech breathed his last and died. Well, now Naomi has no husband to provide for her. She has to rely on her sons who have married Moabite women and any sons that they might have to take care of her in her old age. But as month after month goes by, and both Ruth and Orpah show no signs of bearing children, and as year after year passes with no signs of bearing children, until finally 10 years have passed, and there are no grandsons, and then her 2 sons die. Now Ruth and Naomi and Orpah have nobody. This was a death sentence in the ancient Near East, because I'm sure you know this, the ancient Near East didn't have the Office of Social Security. They did not have a welfare state or any programs to assist poor, impoverished, destitute widows. They had their families. And Naomi's family, the men in particular, the men who in that time were the ones who provided, who worked, who gave you your substance, they're buried 6 feet in the ground. Which means Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, unless something amazing happens, are going to die destitute and alone. And all of that happened because of one fateful decision that a man named Elimelech made when he decided, I'm not going to stay in the hard place. This is too much. The time of the judges, too dark. The famine that's got my granaries empty and my cupboards bare, too much. I'm going east. I'm not going to stay and be a light in the darkness at a time which, by the way, God had promised in Deuteronomy, if there are people who will call on my name and repent and help others to do the same, I will visit my people again. I will lift my hand of judgment and I will restore your fortunes. Instead of leaning on that promise, Elimelech ran away. And his family suffered the consequences for that. Because that is almost always what happens when we run away from the darkness, rather than running into it with the love and the light of God. And I can't tell you what Elimelech was feeling when he made the decision to leave. Obviously, he had no idea this is how this is going to play out. I can't tell you if he went to Moab with a heavy heart or he went with a light one. I can't tell you if as they were packing their belongings, he was mumbling apologies to Naomi and saying sorry, but they had to do what was necessary. I don't know if he was shouting at his family and telling them they just had to do this because no other way were they going to survive. I don't know what he was feeling, what was going through his mind. I only know what he did. And what he did was run away. East, away from the presence of God. And it's a little bit scary if you take long enough of an honest look in the mirror to realize just how much of Elimelech might live inside you. Because it is hard to face the darkness. It's hard to face the darkness that's hiding in the basement corners of your heart, the sins that you don't want to deal with. It's hard to face the darkness of a culture that seems bent on rejecting God and dismissing his word and shaming and trying to do what it can to remove from influence anyone who doesn't follow along in that path. It's hard to face the darkness of a past that you don't want to deal with, that is still sabotaging your life to this day. Any form of darkness is hard and scary to face. But if we will not face the darkness, who else will? Again, Jesus said, you. You people who call me Lord, you are the light of the world. And if you go hiding your light under a blanket, or heaven forbid, if all of us go running the other direction, we go and we found the Horizons Church Monastery on Mount Athos. If we do that, we may think, like Elimelech did, that we're getting away from the darkness, that our life will be better, that things will be easier. But if we run and do that, where is the light that dispels the darkness? It's hidden under a bushel basket. And if we won't go and dispel the darkness by the grace and power of God, guess what? No one will. That's your charge. That's my charge. We can't run away from the dark. We have to run into it with the light and the love of God. Otherwise, we run away from the darkness and we think we're getting away from it. No, you run away from the darkness. You're just giving way to the darkness. And so, in the midst of this tragedy, what does Naomi do? Will she stay in Moab, remain to the east, away from the presence of the Lord? Or will she go back and do the hardest thing imaginable and face the darkness? That leads us to this next truth. God shows his great love to us in dark times so that we can face the darkness and show his great love to others in dark times. Now you see, while Naomi was mourning the loss of her husband, grieving the death of her two sons, the village of Bethlehem that she had originally come from was actually rejoicing. Because God, in his great unfailing love, his loyalty to his people, his faithfulness to his promises, in spite of all the unfaithfulness and sin of his own people, he had visited them again, just as he'd said he would in his word. And he had visited them with food. So the era of the judges was not over. There was still that darkness to deal with, but there was at least the promise that the cupboards might not be bare if we go back and we do the hard thing. And so, when Naomi gets word that God has once again, in his steadfast love and his unfailing kindness, visited his people again, she decides to go back. And here's what we read in verses 6 through 7. Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now you see what's happening? Naomi is now returning from the east. She's going back to the promised land, back to face the darkness. And what that indicates to us is that even if it is just a flicker of a spark, even if it's only the kind of faith that father in the Gospels said he had when he cried out to Jesus, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." whatever it is, Naomi's going back. Because there's just that spark of hope that the Lord has not forgotten his people. And even if it's just a spark for Naomi, it's enough. It's just enough to rekindle her faith and help her go back and face the darkness and deal with the past, deal with a history and a place that she knows is going to be the hardest thing she's ever done. But somewhere along the way, on those dusty roads as she's walking with Ruth and Orpah in tow, she pulls up suddenly and stops. Because somewhere on that journey, she realized that even if she had the faintest flicker of hope, because she was going back to her countrymen, she was going back to people who she at least had some relationship and connection to, who might help care for her. Her 2 daughters-in-law were Moabites. These were people who were despised by the Israelites because Moab had opposed Israel on their way to the Promised Land. Their nations did not get along. In fact, God had even placed a curse on Moab. And so as she looks at these 2 daughters-in-law of hers, she realizes that even though she may have a hope for a future, any hope for her daughters-in-law, impossible at worst, unlikely at best. And so she pulls up, turns to face these 2 women who have been through, we might say, literally hell with her over the past 10 years. And this is what she says to them in these next verses. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband," that is, the husband you hope to go back and remarry. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Now, you see, this is a reasonable thing for her to ask. Their hopes in Bethlehem, impossible at worst, unlikely at best. What she's saying is, go back to your country. Go back to some place you have a connection to people who might try to help care for you. Maybe you can remarry when you're there. Maybe you can finally have sons who will take care of you in your old age. Go back and do the reasonable thing. And as you have shown kindness to me, in fact, what she says is, you have shown to me over these last 10 years the Lord's kindness. The Moabite god that they primarily worshiped was named Chemosh. They sacrificed children to him. What Naomi says is, you haven't shown me the faithfulness of Chemosh. You 2 Moabite women have shown the kindness of the Lord to me. The word she uses there, it's a loaded Hebrew word, hesed. It's a word that if you read it in our English Bibles, you're going to get all kinds of translations for it because it's such a rich word, it's hard to translate and get the full sense of it. But it can mean kindness like it does here. It can mean unfailing love. It can mean covenant loyalty. It can mean keeper of promises. It can mean steadfast love. All of that gets wrapped up in God's hesed, his love and his kindness and his grace to his people, that they not only don't deserve, they've positively demerited, but that he delights to show anyway. And what she says to these 2 Moabite women is, you have shown that to me. I want the Lord to show that to you now. Go home and let him show it to you there. Now, the next few verses detail the back and forth between Naomi and her daughters-in-law and how finally, eventually, Orpah decides, you're right. This is the reasonable choice. I'm going back home. But Ruth, on the other hand, does the unlikely thing. Rather than doing the reasonable thing, the thing that makes sense, Ruth has seen something in Naomi that has drawn her to the Lord. She has rejected Chemosh and that false way of life. And what she has seen in Naomi of the Lord's kindness so draws her to Naomi that even against all of Naomi's protests, this is what Ruth goes on to say in these next verses, verses 15 through 18. And Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord, not Chemosh, not any of the false gods of Canaan, may the Lord, Yahweh, the faithful, covenant, steadfast, loving, hesed-showing God of Israel, may the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said, "No more." You see what's happened? God has shown through Naomi his hesed, his light, his unfailing love to Ruth, the Moabite. And now Ruth, the Moabite, is going to return the unfailing kindness and love and light of God in his hesed to Naomi, a woman who has nothing she can give her in return, nothing she can do for her, but she knows this is the right thing to do. And even with that little flicker of hope that there's just food waiting on the horizon, they both go back, they face the darkness, and they deal with a past that could sabotage what they're doing right now in the most honest and perhaps even shocking terms as they step into an uncertain future. Because here's what happens in the remainder of this chapter. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" You can imagine them seeing her walking in from the distance, this woman who left with a full family in tow, now coming back alone with an unfamiliar woman. Haggard, probably wrinkled, worn out. "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi." It's a name that literally means pleasant. Do not call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Why call me pleasant when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now here's the thing. You may feel like Naomi. Again, you may look at all the darkness like she was, looking at her old familiar home village, thinking about all the darkness had taken away from her. So much so, she said, "Don't call me by my name anymore. Call me a new one. Call me bitter. That's what the darkness has done to me." You may look at your life and may look at the darkness around you and feel like that. And you may wonder what in the world you could possibly do to dispel that kind of darkness, what kind of hope there is that that kind of darkness can be driven back, that your brokenness can be healed, that what is lost can be found and restored. You may feel like Naomi and even want to look at the hand of a provident, almighty God, because that is who he is, an almighty and a provident God, and say, how could this kind of a life, this kind of bitterness have been dealt out to me? That may be where you are. But you don't dispel that kind of darkness unless you are willing, like Naomi, with just the faintest flicker of hope and the faintest token of God's steadfast love, to go back and face the darkness like she did. Because if you are willing to do that, you have no idea what unlikely things God may do. All they had to go off of was faith that God had visited his people with food. The barley harvest was beginning. That's all they had to work off of. That was it. And yet it was enough to send them back home. And when you look at your life, you may not have the faintest clue what it will look like for you to go back and face that darkness and that hardship. But when Naomi and Ruth went back, they had no idea that they were paving the way within 3 generations for God to do one of the most unlikely things imaginable to save his people, redeem them, and then ultimately, in ways that none of us could ever have dreamed up or fathomed on our own, save the entire world. And all just because they were willing to go back and face the darkness, not knowing what their future held in store. And so here's what I know. You may want to run away and stay away from the darkness because you think hope lies east. But here is what I know. I have discovered it in my own life. I know it because God has told me in his word. Hope is always found in the dark. Because when you go into the dark, that is where the light of Christ is residing to dispel the darkness. The light of Christ, he does not hide it under a bushel basket. He does not keep his light hidden up in heaven. Jesus came down. His light dispels and lives, we might say, in the darkness. And what that means is hope is found in the darkness. You and I will not find hope by running away from the dark. We will only find it by running to the darkness, in and with the light of God's unfailing love, his hesed. Because light does not dispel the darkness by running away from it. You and I, as the lights of the world, dispel the darkness by running into it. And as we are going to see in these upcoming weeks, if God dispelled the deepest, darkest yet in Israel's history through 3 of the most unlikely people, this Moabite, this old widow, and another man we're going to meet who was a confirmed bachelor, 3 unlikely people in a backwater, no-name village in Judah. If he could dispel the deepest darkness they had yet seen through those 3 unlikely people, you tell me, what's to stop God from dispelling the darkness around us through the most unlikely people imaginable, the kind of people that the rest of the world would write off, a bunch of backwater people from West Virginia, whom others would write off and say, what in the world does West Virginia have to offer the world? I'll tell you what we have to offer the world. We have the light of Christ. We have the hope of the gospel. And so if God did it through them, who knows in generations yet to come what God might do through us to rekindle hope if we will just do the unlikely thing. If we will look to him in faith, if we will trust him in our darkest hour and say, by your grace and your help, Lord, I'm not running from the darkness. I will run into it with your light and your love. But you and I won't do that, can't do it, unless we know the light of the world lives in us and goes with us. So I'm going to pray that we come to know that truth.